So, I'd like to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today, as you can see from the slide, the topic is sketching tips for power users. So, think of these as advanced sketching tips in Onshape. And I say, power users or advanced sketching tips because it really isn't intended for those that are just getting started. If you're just getting a grasp of the sketch mechanics in Onshape, you're just getting a feel for how that works. Definitely want to spend some more time doing that before you get to some of these tips. But if you're an experienced CAD user or if you've spent a fair amount of time in Onshape and you're familiar with our sketching tools, these are the tips that will take you to the next level, so to speak, that will help you be that much more efficient, more productive. A lot of them are just little things, little changes that you can make, say ways to save clicks here and there. And a lot of things are just things that are easy to miss, subtle pieces of the interface or how Onshape sketching tools work that can make a big difference in how you go about using our sketch tools. So let's get started. As I always say with these webinars, I really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question that you'd like, and I'll do my best to stop and answer the questions as we go through today's webinar. The agenda today is very straightforward. I'm just going to go through some of my personal favorite sketch tips. And again, these are geared towards what I would call the higher level user, someone that's spent a fair amount of time in Onshape and sketching in Onshape and is really looking for little things that they can do to up their productivity, right? To up their efficiency in the sketching. So, as I always say with these webinars, feel free to ask any questions and I'll do my best to stop and answer them. So, without further ado, let's jump right into things. Now, I'd like to do this just, jumping between tips. So I'm going to be doing quite a bit of back and forth, forgive me, between my slide deck and Onshape itself. And we're going to go through things rather quickly. Each one of these tips is short, and I can get through them quickly. So again, feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. All right, so let's get started. All right, so left click drag. My first tip for you is a useful way to work with sketch geometry in a few different ways, actually. So one of the first tips that I would give you is when you're using offset, the offset feature in the sketch toolbar, and you want to offset a series of lines and arcs or a chain of entities, so to speak, it's very easy to left click drag one piece of the chain of entities that you want to offset, and it will offset the entire thing. Right? Now, this is particularly important if you have, say, a dozen lines or arcs that you want to offset all at once. Right? Left click selecting them is not practical, and maybe window selecting them is not very easy, but you want to chain select everything and offset it. Well, that's left click drag. So that's one example where left click drag is really useful in the offset feature. Another example where left click drag is really useful is when you're creating a sketch fillet. So in the sketch fillet feature, if you left click drag a point, it will give you a dynamically changing sketch fillet. Very useful if you want to kind of, eyeball, so to speak, the radius of the sketch fillet to approximate size and then let go. So that's different than the default behavior. Default behavior would be just left clicking a point and you get a default value for your sketch fillet. So again, left click drag instead of just left clicking gives you different behavior. In the sketch fillet feature, it allows you to dynamically resize the size of the fillet. The last example I would give you of where left click drag behavior is different is when sketching a line. So there are two ways to sketch a line, and many beginning users just use the two-click method, right? And two-click method is very common. Again, left click, and you have a line. But what's also, not quite as popular, but very productive is a left click drag line, right? So instead of two left clicks, you left click drag and let go, and you have a line. Now, the benefit of this approach is that by default, it does not assume that you want to continue creating lines. So there's not that additional click, escape, out of the line feature that you would normally have if you've, just using the two-click method, right? And I'll go over an example of these in just a moment, so bear with me. But that's a small thing, but it can be a big deal if you're going right back into another feature, because you'd have to escape out of the line, go into another feature, maybe click on another line again, and that's a few additional clicks. But if you do it enough during a period of a day, that makes a big difference. So all of these are meant to kind of make things a little bit more efficient, allow you to get to your end result quicker. I think that's the goal with these. And I'm going to go over just a few of them, so bear with me. Let me jump into a document here. This is just a blank sketch. And what I'd like to do is start with the most basic of those tips, and that is just the line example. So by default, many new users and many experienced users as well will use the 2-click method for creating lines, right? That is left click, and you have your line, right? Now, by default, when you do this, it assumes that you want to continue on with another line. And so if that's the case, this is the tool that you'd want to use, because then I can go on, left click another time, and I'd have another line that's attached to my previous one. So again, a very important workflow for creating lines. But there will be those scenarios where you want to create just one line and you don't want to continue on with more lines, right? And that's where left click drag is really useful. So this line was created with 2 left clicks of the mouse, whereas the left click drag, as the name implies, I left click, hold down the left mouse button, move my cursor to where I want the line to end, and then left click again, or excuse me, let go, right? So again, you're not clicking twice, you left click, hold down, drag, and let go. And by default, it does not assume that you want another line, right? So very useful in those situations where you're trying to create geometry, but you don't want the assumption that it's going to create another line afterwards. Because what many users will do is, unaware that there's this left click drag method, they will escape out, go back to the line command, and it just creates kind of this loop for every single one of those kinds of situations. So that's one of the first tips that I can give you with regards to left click drag. And the left click drag, it gives you different behavior in lines, right? Now, another example where this is different is the sketch fillet. So let's just sketch a center rectangle here. So here's a center point rectangle. And what I want to do is I want to fillet the corners. I want to fillet them to, a roughly that size, size that I'm kind of outlining there with my cursor. I don't know what that size is with respect to the rest of the sketch. And, I can go to the sketch fillet command and just click the point, but it's going to default to a certain value, right? So if I left click this point, it's just going to default to some value, in this case, 0.25, right? Now, that's the default approach, and that's the approach that many will use up to this point. But what you can also do is select sketch fillet. Instead of left clicking the point, you left click drag the point, right? And it will allow you to dynamically resize the sketch fillet, as you move your cursor in and out, right? So if I want a radius about that size, I can just let go, and there is my radius, right? One other tip that I would give you, this is just kind of a random tip, but if you've created your first sketch fillet and then you continue clicking points, it will continue placing radiuses of the same size on those points. So you should really only have to define the radius once and then go through and select each point where that radius should apply, and it will apply radius and give it the equal constraint, meaning this dimension will drive the sketch fillets that were created during that time, right? All right, so I see a few questions. In our company, we go with configurations and equations. So what is the best to design the whole project in the Part Studio or assembly? I would do my best to avoid having everything in a single Part Studio for performance reasons. It depends on the size of your project, but I would consider strongly the assembly. Which means you'll probably need techniques like in-context design and so on. If I want to change the same part in all assemblies, what's the best way to do that? It would be to edit, from that Part Studio. Left clicking keeps adding new lines, which is great, but it terminates if you click on an existing vertex. Yes, and that is by design, by the way. Um, the assumption being that you've now finished, you've closed the loop, so to speak, and there's no need for it to continue on. But it is a good thing to point out. So just to reiterate this comment, left clicking keeps adding new lines, which is great, but it stops adding new lines when you click on an existing vertex. And that is by design. If it's something you don't care for, please let us know. But the idea behind that is that once you've selected another vertex from that existing entity, the assumption is you wouldn't want to go further, right? So let's move on to my next tip, and that is offset. So I mentioned sketch fillet and the ability to left click drag a point, and that will give you a dynamically resizing sketch fillet. That's another example where left click drag gives you a different behavior than what you would get normally, just left clicking a point. Another example of this is in the offset feature. So in offset at the sketch level, if I select offset and I just select an individual piece of sketch geometry, say this line for instance, I get an offset of just that one line. So you can see here's my offset of just the individual entity that I selected, right? Now, if I have dozens of lines and arcs that I want to offset all at once, then selecting them individually is not practical in many situations. At the very least, it's tedious, right? So what I'd like to do is grab all of these at once. I've been asked the question, do you have things like chain select, or do you have kind of selection tools? And we're going to go over one. We could go over, in a bit, window select. You've seen me use a few times. But what I'd recommend is left click drag, right? So I select the offset feature from the toolbar, and then instead of left clicking an individual piece of the sketch that I want to offset, I left click drag that piece, right? So I left click drag, and what happens is it automatically selects the chain of entities attached to whatever you're left click dragging on, right? So it's an easy way to grab all of, that's a bit too big there, all of the lines and arcs and so on without having to left click them individually or window select them or any of those types of things. So that's a very big tip that I have for you. If you do a lot of offsetting of sketch geometry, manually selecting each individual piece is not practical in some applications, and that's where left click dragging is just a much easier solution. Okay, so again, left click drag, that's the overall sketch tip that I have for you. It's useful in a number of different applications, so I wanted to highlight them there, but just keep that in mind. It's definitely a valuable tool, right? All right, so question, left click, does that work for non-sketch geometry? I'm assuming you're referring to the left click drag. This is all specific to sketch geometry. I could convert a face, for instance, and offset that, or offset a face if that's what I have. But yeah, does this work for in context sketches? Yes, in context sketches shouldn't behave any differently than normal sketches in terms of the rules that I'm discussing here today. Yeah. So all of this should apply just the same to in context sketches as they do to regular parts with no contextual relationships. If I go with assemblies, then how can I use configurations? Any way I can use configurations in the assembly? No. Good question. Today we do not have assembly level configurations, but that is what I would call one of our biggest priorities in the company. So if you need configurations today, you must use the Part Studio, but we are definitely aware of the need. I would say it is, again, one of our biggest priorities. All right, so that's my first tip for you. My next tip is in the linear pattern command. So this is referring to linear sketch patterns, right? So patterns of sketch geometry. And this is one of those features that's very subtle, but very, very powerful. And I always like to point these things out because these are things that are not immediately obvious that can really add a lot of design intent and really allow you to build powerful sketch level patterns very easily. So a few things that I would stress. One of the most important things I would stress about linear patterns, or circular patterns for that matter, is they can be easily edited after they were created. And that's something that not a lot of users are aware of. So if you create a linear sketch pattern and then you need to go in and change the distance or change the orientation or change anything associated with it, you can do that. So patterns can be easily edited. They're controlled via some basic dimensions and sketch geometry, and you can edit those no different than any other sketch or dimension. Another one that commonly comes up is, can I dimension my patterns different ways? So by default, when I create a pattern, a sketch pattern, for instance, it has default distances between values, right? So if I'm patterning a hole, for instance, a circle, let's say, I'm giving it X distance between each instance of the pattern, which is just a kind of a dumb number, so to speak, right? It's just X distance between each hole. But what if I wanted, 6 instances between this and the end of the part? Right? That's not a dumb number, so to speak. It needs to measure the distance to the end of the part and then figure out what is the evenly spaced 6 instances across that distance. So it's a little bit more intelligent in terms of how it behaves. You can do that in Onshape. You could delete the distance dimension and replace it with some other dimension that better reflects your design intent. That's a little known trick that you can't do even at the feature level today, right? So at the feature level, I have, if I want to do a feature pattern, a linear feature pattern, I just enter a number and I set a direction, right? But I can't intelligently say pattern 6 evenly timed instances up to this face. Those types of things are still limitations. But at the sketch level, you can do that, right? You can do that by deleting the distance dimension. Another question that comes up often is, can I delete individual instances within the pattern? And the answer is yes. You could just window select geometry, delete that individual instance. It does not impact the pattern. In other words, you can still make edits to the pattern, and the pattern will update even without that individual instance. So just to stress this, the pattern isn't this fragile thing that can't be touched after it was created. After you've created a pattern, you can go back and edit the number. You can delete instances. You can change the angle of the pattern. You can do all of that after it's been created. So again, to highlight that, the sketch, so what you'll see in just a moment, when we create that pattern, it creates a sketch, and there are a few driving dimensions and sketch entities that we can edit, and that's how we go back and manipulate the pattern. All right, so let's get into this. Let's jump into an example. And so what I have is this part, and what I have on the face of the part is just a simple sketch, right? And what I'd like to do is pattern this face, right, this sketch entity, across this face, right? So let's go in and edit that sketch. This is sketch 1 in this case. And what we want to do is pattern this geometry. So I'll select the linear pattern command from the toolbar, then window select the geometry I want to pattern. Now I have my pattern. Now, a few tips. By default, you'll see these arrows. If I want to change the direction of the pattern, I can left-click the arrow, and it will flip the direction of the pattern the other way. I can also grab that arrow and drag it to dynamically resize. So those are things I think many users, if you've used linear patterns, you're aware of. Another one that I would point out, not many are aware of, you can also grab this point on the manipulator and move up, right, or down. So by default, it's going to assume that you want to go horizontal with the x-axis, for instance. But what if you wanted to align your pattern with an edge of the part? Well, I'd move this close to that direction and then edit my sketch later to actually make it parallel, right? To define it afterwards. My point in this being, by default, it's going to assume that you want a horizontal or vertical pattern, but you don't have to. Right? You can, make those changes. You can grab and drag and dynamically change things around as you see fit, right? Now, another thing I would point out, another commonly asked question is, how would we do multiple directions in a linear sketch pattern? And the answer to that is to grab the second arrow. So by default, you'll have this arrow, which is along the x-axis, so to speak, but then you can grab this second arrow, and that will create a pattern of those original pattern instances. So now we've added 3 more pattern instances to this sketch, right? So, as I mentioned before, um, the pattern is still very editable after it's been accepted. One very important tip with regards to accepting the pattern is you must left click an empty space to accept, right? So very important, left click just anywhere in empty space to accept the pattern, right? That's something that is a bit different, than other commands in Onshape. So one very important tip, again, left click an empty space to accept. Now, as I mentioned before, this is very much driven by a sketch. So what happens in the linear sketch feature, these sketch entities are added. In fact, you'll see 2 construction lines here and 2 dimension entities here, right? 2 dimensions controlling things. And then I have this instance count number. So at any point, I can come back and change this instance count and add more instances to the pattern, right? Or I could double click this dimension and change the distance between them at any point, right? If I don't want a single instance, I can window select and delete that individual instance. And again, it does not impact the rest of them, right? They still all behave the way you'd expect. The important thing I would stress is you can constrain this geometry in ways that you would typically do at the sketch level. So for instance, let's say that I wanted these slot profiles to be aligned with an edge of my part. Instead of these being constrained horizontal or vertical, I could select this line, another edge of my part, and make those parallel. And that would ensure that my pattern is parallel with an edge of my part, right? So again, you can get creative with these. I would place them initially, get them close to what you're looking for, and then go in and edit these, constrain these in a way that makes sense to you. One other example I would give you, let's make this horizontal here, is let's say, for instance, that I don't want, just this dumb number driving the value, right? So right now I'm doing a linear sketch pattern with 4 instances at 1.5 distance between each instance. But what if I want it to be a little bit more intelligent? What if I want to say, okay, I don't want it driven by this value. I want to say between the original instance and the end of the part, give me 4 equally spaced instances. I don't know what the spacing value would be for that, but that's where kind of the beauty of this approach comes in. All I really need to do is dimension to something else, right? So I just deleted the driving dimension, the 1.5 dimension, 1.25 dimension, and now I'm replacing with something else. In this case, let's say 3, right? But now I'm driving the distance between each pattern instance based on the distance from the end, right? So it just depends on your approach, what your goals are. You may have, variables that are tied to each other, and trying to build this in an intelligent way. I think the biggest reason for that would be, things like configurations or building different size, variations later on. Good question. Can you recover a deleted instance, or are you just hiding it? If you can immediately with just a simple undo, but recovering it past that point would require a full restore. If it's months from now, for instance. But if it's just I deleted it and I deleted the wrong one, I can always just hit undo and bring it back. It is a moment in the history just like any other. So in theory, you could, dimension, or you could delete it and bring it back in the same way. Typically, it was better practice to pattern the feature rather than using a sketch pattern. The same hold true in Onshape. Sketch level versus feature, pros and cons in Onshape. I would say that it's safe to assume that the feature patterns are going to perform better if for whatever reason you don't want to use feature patterns. Sketch patterns are an option. I will say that sketch patterns obviously have their limits, right? They're 2D, they're a sketch, so they're not useful in all applications. But I will say they definitely have value in certain applications like this, where I may want to dimension distance from an edge, for instance. and that's something that you can't do today with a feature pattern, right? At least not easily. So those are the things I would keep in mind. Sketch patterns certainly apply for certain types of geometry, and I would also say that certain simple applications, sketch geometry makes more sense than feature patterns, right? Can the number of instances be driven by a config variable? I think that's a limitation today. I know it was a limitation in the past. I believe it's still a limitation today. Very good question. Can I drive this number, the number of instances, by a variable? I would need to double check that, but I do remember that at one point definitely being a limitation. All right. Can you dimension off the far edge so that it is equal to the pattern spacing instance? Can you dimension off the far edge so that it is equal to the pattern spacing instance? No. I'm trying to imagine what that would look like. Equal to the pattern spacing instance. I could set the pattern spacing instance to a certain amount. But then the distance from the end hole to the end of the part is a fixed driven dimension, right? The only way for me to get those two to be the same, I would have to think ahead, and I would have to do a variable from one end, and then drive it with the distance between each value, and then just ensure that the end value lines up with that. That's a good question. I can't think of a very easy way. I may be missing something obvious, admittedly, but I can't think of a very easy way to do what you're asking there. What if you just turned off the? What if you just turn the geometry to construction geometry of a single pattern instance? Good question. It affects only that instance. So to reiterate the question, what if you turned the geometry to construction geometry of a single pattern instance? It does not go downstream, so to speak, right? So the pattern instance is not update. Now, I'm fairly certain if you pattern to begin with construction geometry, will get construction geometry, but it doesn't update, so to speak. Can you save the instances but release them from control so you can randomly place them? No. Construction line drawn on the end made equal. I believe that's in reference to the past question, and I believe that would work. Yeah, so this is the same comment. Add horizontal sketch lines and make them equal. Yeah. A linear pattern at feature level, you would hide an instance rather than delete. Again, we don't have a hide equivalent. So we do delete the geometry. When I window select an instance within the pattern, it deletes it. It can always be brought back again with an undo or something along those lines, but it is a true delete, not a hide. You could use two construction lines, and this is a reference to the question earlier. All right, so let's move on. That was my big tip on the linear sketch pattern. It allows you to do some really neat things with constraining your geometry relative to model edges or defining patterns based on outside models, right? The edges of a model, for instance, which is something you currently can't do at the feature level today. All right, so that was the next tip. Moving on to my next tip in my list, select constraints first. So this is something that really applies to a very specific situation. I think it's most useful if you need to apply a lot of the same constraint back to back in a row. So say, for instance, I have a dozen holes and I need to create a dozen concentric constraints in a row. That's where this is most useful. It's a subtle thing. It's a subtle difference in how you create your constraints at the sketch level, but it means many less clicks potentially. And in short, the difference is instead of selecting the geometry that you want to constrain and then selecting the constraint from the toolbar, you select the constraint from the toolbar and then select the geometry you want to constrain. And it sounds like a very small difference, and it is, but the big thing that this does is it means that if you select the constraint first, the constraint will remain active until you escape out of it. And that's very useful if you're applying the same constraint back to back to back, right? Because otherwise, if you follow the traditional workflow of selecting the geometry first and then selecting the constraint from your toolbar, you will need to go to select that same constraint from the toolbar over and over and over again. But if I select it first, then it's automatically active, and it just keeps going as I keep clicking on geometry. So let me show you an example of this. This one's relatively easy to show. So what I'd like to do is make all of these holes concentric with arcs. Let's just say that you have a series of holes in you or other geometry you need to add a lot of the same constraint in a row. The traditional workflow is I select the geometry, in this case the circle, the arc. I select the icon on the toolbar, right? In this case, concentric. So again, left click, left click, left click, right? Left click, left click, left click. And I just keep doing this. And this will work, of course, but if you have a lot of geometry you need to constrain, this is very difficult to do. It's tedious. So there is a way that you can speed this up, and that is rather than selecting geometry first, you select the constraint first, right? So you left click. Now this is active until you escape out of it. And the difference here is now I could come in and select geometry and go straight to the next one, geometry, right? And it will constrain as I go. So I don't have to keep going back to the toolbar to select the constraint that I'm looking for, right? So very subtle one, I know, but if you find yourself in a situation where you need to add a whole lot of equals constraints or concentric constraints or whatever it may be, just select the constraint first, then just start left-clicking on the individual things that you need to constrain, and it will just keep adding constraints, right? All right, so that is my next tip. Select the constraints first. All right, the next one. You've seen me use this a number of times, but I do want to take a moment to describe how it works, because the question comes up often, especially from those that have a lot of CAD experience, especially if you've come from, even 2D CAD, AutoCAD world where, this was applicable even then. The window select. The window select is certainly not a new concept for Onshape, and there are a few things that are specific to window select that have come from, generations of CAD. And one of the most common questions that I get asked is there a difference between a left to right or a right to left window select in terms of what gets selected? And the answer is yes, right? So in short, if you're not familiar with window select, you left click drag and Onshape creates a window. And depending on the direction that you dragged, either right to left or left to right, the things inside of your window will be selected differently. So if you drag from right to left, everything touching your window is selected. Everything touching being the key word. Now, if you drag from left to right, everything fully encompassed within your window will be selected, right? And that distinction is very important if you have a very big sketch and you're trying to define or trying to select dozens of entities within a sketch consisting of hundreds, and you're trying to grab certain entities, where a left to right selection may give you exactly what you're looking for, whereas a right to left selection gives you many excess things, many things you never wanted, right? So that is a very big tip that I have for you, especially if you spend a lot of time in complex sketches where selecting entities is everything and selecting the right, combination of entities is everything, because the difference between right to left and left to right may make a big difference in the time that you have to select things, right? In general, if you're not familiar with window select, it's just a very useful way of selecting a lot of geometry at once. And it's not just applicable to the sketch level, it's just that's what we're focusing on here today. All right, so an example of this, as I mentioned, right to left will select anything touching your selection, right? So if you look closely, these lines in particular, these two lines of part of the top and bottom of this left rectangle are selected, right? But if I do that again, I did not fully encompass those lines, but they're touching the window. So again, right to left, anything touching the window will be selected. Now, if we do this the opposite way, right, if I go from left to right, watch again the lines on the top and bottom of the rectangle. They are not selected, right? This line and this line were not selected because my window did not fully encompass those lines, right? And that distinction again becomes very important when you're trying to make a big selection of sketch geometry. And the right to left technique gives you way too much. The left to right technique might be exactly what you're looking for. So that is the window tip select. I know you've seen me use window select a number of times, but I just wanted to point out the distinction there between the right to left and left to right. All right, next tip. Dimension as you go. This is another commonly asked question. Is it possible to add dimensions as I'm sketching? And the short answer is yes. If you type in a value immediately after placing a sketch entity, a line or a circle or a rectangle, it will dimension that entity. And it means that you can sketch, dimension, kind of in tandem as you go, rather than sketching out a bunch of geometry and then coming back and adding dimensions afterwards. And I think that's the common workflow. So if you're looking for a way to speed up dimensions in particular, and you know exactly what the value is as you're sketching it, you can type in that value as you go. So let's just jump into an example here. Let's go ahead and create a new part. And as I mentioned before, the key to this is as you're sketching, let's say for instance I'm sketching lines. As soon as you place your line, as soon as I left click to place the geometry, you'll see a number as I'm sketching. As soon as I left click to place it, there's a little box that appears around that number. So as soon as I place whatever sketch geometry I'm placing, that number appears. I can then go immediately to type in the value. In this case, we'll type 2.5, enter, and now I've not only sketched the line, but I've also added a dimension to constrain the line, right? And we can keep going. So now I'm still in the line command. I can keep going. Let's say that I want another line. Left click, same thing. You'll see that box appear over the dimension, 3.5, enter, and now I've added a line at 3.5. So again, it's a very quick way to sketch geometry and define geometry at the exact same time, right? And it's not specific to lines, right? So let's window select here and delete. And let's say I'm placing a circle. Same thing. Left click, 8, enter, and now I've inserted a circle and dimensioned that circle, right? Just by typing in a value immediately after placing it, right? So that's a commonly asked question. It's something that I think a lot of power users will get a lot of use out of, right? Especially the geometry like circles or like rectangles, where you immediately know the size that you want when you insert it. I can easily insert dimension and then I'm off and running. Right. I mentioned before rectangles. Well, the question then how are rectangles handled? Because they have two dimensions that you have to define. It simply goes between the two dimensions. Right. So let's left click. I'll enter. You can see the box highlights. So if you look closely, there are two dimensions there. The one that I'm inserting is highlighted. You'll see the box around it. I'll type in 11, enter, and then it goes to the next dimension, right? Which I can say, let's say 10, enter. So now I've inserted a center rectangle and I've dimensioned it. Right. So very quickly, add dimensions on the fly as you build your sketch geometry. All right. So that is my next tip for you. Dimension as you go. The next one is use the ability to wake up references. I think the strongest Onshape users, the most experienced Onshape users use this functionality a lot because it saves you tremendous amount of time in manually constraining sketch entities. And so let me explain what I mean by this. Again, the thing to keep in mind is it really does save you from having to manually constrain most things. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I'm sketching a revolve profile, and it's a revolve profile of this round pulley shape. It's got several contours, and what I'm trying to construct here is kind of a symmetric profile, and I could mirror things across, but let's just say that I'm sketching these lines, and I reach this point where I'm sketching this line, but in reality, this should be the exact same length as the line to the right of it, right? And what I need is a relationship to this point over here. So a tip is you can wake up just about any reference. And the way you do that is move your cursor over the reference that you want to wake up, in this case, this point. So I move my cursor over that point, and then when I go back, you'll see that point is now a reference that I can add my geometry to. The big thing here is now if I left click, I do not have to come back and add that equal constraint or whatever it is later on, right? And this is going to be very common as you're sketching. So let's do this again. If I left click, let's say that I'm bringing down this line on this side, and what I want is a constraint to that point over there on the right. But you can see there's no reference that's been pointed out there. All I need to do is move my cursor over that point, and it will wake up that reference, right? And now I can constrain my line to the point, making them equal, without having to come back and manually do that later. Same goes for this point. Move my cursor. It does not reference this point, so I will move my cursor over it, wake it up, and there is my finished sketch profile. So again, waking up reference points, I can't stress this enough, is really useful tool that will save you a tremendous amount of constraint adding, later. That's the alternative to this workflow, is coming back and saying this and this should be equal, and this and this should be equal, or adding a horizontal constraint between this and this. You'd have to go back and do that manually yourself if you're not waking up these references, right? All right, so that's waking up references. Again, the key thing is to move your mouse over whatever it is that you want to wake up, hover over it for a second, and it will wake up that reference, right? And the appeal there is just the amount of time that you save. Now, another question that comes up often is, how do I delete constraints? They're difficult to select, or, if I turn on all constraints, I'll always see is a whole bunch of white flags, and it's difficult to figure out what's what, and understanding what constraints are associated with what geometry, and making that easy is something that we're always working on. But one thing that I would recommend is you can use the Shift key to lock the constraints on the screen. And the reason I say that is, in many cases, when of course, you have the ability to show all the constraints. There's a checkbox, right? I can show all constraints, but there may be too many, and it's difficult to decipher what's what, when you're showing everything. The alternative, of course, to showing everything is mousing over individual pieces of geometry. If you mouse over an individual piece of geometry, it will highlight the constraints associated with that piece of geometry. Of course, that's much more useful, right? But the problem with that approach is if you move your cursor the wrong way, or if you move it a certain direction, those flags suddenly disappear. The way to fix that is this tip, Shift. Hold down the Shift key, it locks the constraints onto the screen, and then you'll have no issue selecting them, right? So I'll go over a really simple example of this. By default, you can see I do not see any constraints in my sketch environment. If I check Show Constraints, you'll see all the little constraint flags appear, right? If I need to delete a constraint, I can just left click and hit Delete key, and it deletes that constraint. If I mouse over the geometry involved in that constraint, you'll see, if I mouse over the constraint, you'll see the geometry, right? So in this case, I'm mousing over the parallel constraint. It highlights the two lines involved with that constraint. If I mouse over this perpendicular constraint, it highlights the two lines involved with that constraint. Now, sometimes checking Show Constraints is too much. you'll see too many constraints on the screen, and it's just not very easy to find what you're looking for. And so the other workflow, of course, to finding the constraints that you need is mousing over the geometry that you're interested in. So if I am interested in what constraints are associated with this line, I move my mouse over that line, and you'll see a little flag appear. In this case, parallel. So the only constraint associated with this line is the parallel constraint. Right? Move this line, same thing. Right? Now, what you may run into from time to time is occasionally it's difficult to select these flags. In this case, it's a very simple sketch, and that's not the case. I can easily click the flag and hit delete and delete that constraint. But what if I'm struggling? Let's say, for instance, I mouse over my geometry, and then I move my cursor and that flag just disappears, and I can't select it and easily delete it. My tip is if you mouse over the geometry, it highlights those constraints. The constraints appear as little flags. If you hold down Shift, it doesn't matter where you move your cursor. That constraint will always be visible on the screen as long as Shift is being held down. And it's really useful if you need to select, other things, or if you need to, move your mouse around to get to the flag to delete it. Because by default, those little flags appear based on your proximity to the geometry, right? And so it's easy for them to disappear. Holding Shift will force them to stay on the screen, right? So that is Shift. Again, it's a very useful way to lock the constraints on the screen so that you can easily select them and delete them. All right, the next tip. This is just a very commonly asked question that's very subtle, but very easy to do in Onshape, and that is dimension to the inside or the outside of arcs. So it's a very commonly asked question. How do I dimension to the inside or the outside of an arc, right? Is there some special switch that I have to flip in order to dimension to the minimum or maximum or whatever you refer to it as? And the short answer is no. All you have to do is select the part of the circle or arc that you want to dimension to, and Onshape will automatically recognize, you selected the outside of this arc, or you selected the inside of this arc or circle. That's where the dimension will come from. So it's very intuitive, it's very easy, but I think it's simple to miss because many other CAD applications, this is a switch or something that you have to control outside of the dimension. So let me give you an example of this. Bear with me for a moment here. Here we have a very simple sketch with two circles. Of course, by default, many users will select a point and give you a dimension between the two center points of the circles. But of course, it's also very common to dimension to the outside of the circles or arcs, or to the inside of the circles or arcs for other design intent reasons. So the question comes up, how do you do this in Onshape? It's very simple. If you want a dimension to the outside of the arcs, select the outside of the arc as your selection, right? Onshape recognizes where on the circle or the arc that you've selected, and if I select on the outside portion of those arcs, it's going to default to dimension on the outside, right? Because that's where I've selected on the arc, right? Now, same thing goes for the inside. If I select the inside of the arc or circle and inside of the arc or circle, I get a dimension to the inside, right? But there's no special options or keyboard shortcuts or checkboxes that you have to think about. It's really just where did you click on the arc or circle. That's what determines where that dimension is taken from, right? All right, so that is arc dimensions. Again, you can just select anywhere on the arc, and where you click on the arc is what determines where the dimension is taken from. All right, the next tip that I have for you. Many people know that we have a slot command, a slot feature at the sketch level. And this is really useful, of course, for creating your kind of quintessential slot, right? Straight line, arc on either end, slot. I think the what we commonly picture. But I do want to point out a very big tip that I have for you is the slot feature works, the slot sketch feature works on just about any geometry, any kind of sketch geometry. So you can create a slot around an arc, right? You could create a slot around a spline. You could create a slot around a rectangle, right? So again, just to stress that the slot command at the sketch level is very versatile. Many people think of it as only a tool that works or is applicable to a straight line slot, but that's not the case. And I know there are many out there that have, manually constructed arc slots when they didn't realize that there was a button that would do just that, right? So just to illustrate this takes just a moment, but under the offset feature in the sketch toolbar, you have slot. And again, of course, it works for your typical straight line slots, but it also works for splines, right? Or arcs, right? Or, rectangles. So if you're just looking for a fast way to generate slots around geometry, this is a tool that will work for you. And it's not just for straight lines, right? So I guess that's my big tip. I know many users out there that would do a whole bunch of offsets and constructed arcs to accomplish the same thing as what you would get with the slot feature at the sketch level, right? So that is slots. Let's move on to the next tip. Now, the next tip is my biggest tip for you. And I think it's the single biggest thing that you can do to improve productivity at the sketch level. And that is keyboard shortcuts. You've seen me use a ton of these in this webinar. In any of the webinars I do a lot of keyboard shortcuts. I'm a big fan of keyboard shortcuts, and I can't recommend them enough, especially for those out there doing a lot of heavy sketching. Because of all the tools that are available and all the mouse travel that would be involved in going back and forth the toolbar, keyboard shortcuts can be a huge benefit, right? So I can't stress this enough. Take the time to open up those keyboard shortcuts, maybe print them out, put them up on a second monitor, take a moment to learn, what do I do commonly and how can or where's that keyboard shortcut? Because that will speed up my day-to-day work in Onshape, right? Whether it's the trivial things, it could be, how do I bring up a line, or how do I make something coincident, right? Or, how do I do, some of these features that I'm constantly going to the toolbar for? That's where keyboard shortcuts are really useful. In my opinion, they save a significant amount of mouse travel. It's really most applicable to those that do CAD a lot, those that spend a lot of time doing CAD. But if you fall into that category, I definitely recommend having, spend some time in keyboard shortcuts. Question, very good question that's come up. Can I create custom keyboard shortcuts? No. That is something I would say is high on our list of priorities, though. Many users have asked for it. Today, the list of keyboard shortcuts is fixed. So you would need to learn that list in order to do what I'm going to show you here today. Do you have a PDF of the shortcuts or a link to that page? Bear with me for just a moment and I will show you. All right, so let's get into the keyboard shortcuts. First question that gets asked, how do I find the keyboard shortcuts? They are under the Help menu. So in the top right corner, under the question mark, you'll find keyboard shortcuts. Now this will bring out a flyout, a modal window on top of the screen. What you really want, and what many users want to do, is export this as a PDF or put this on a separate monitor, for instance. You can do that by clicking the arrow in the top right. So a little tip for you if you're learning the keyboard shortcuts, click the arrow in the top right. That will make it its own window in your browser. You can print this, you can move it to a different monitor, you can do just about anything that you'd like now that it's its own, instance of your browser. But again, the keyboard shortcuts are a very big tip that I would give for you. Under that question mark menu, you have sketch shortcuts, part shortcuts, drawing shortcuts, assembly shortcuts, as well as overall shortcuts. But the first tip that I would give you again is just the keyboard shortcuts. You'll find them under the question mark menu. Now, there's a lot of things that you could do with keyboard shortcuts. We all have our personal favorites. I'll show you a few of my personal favorites. The first one is N. One of the most important things you'll do when you're starting your sketch is go normal to the sketch plane, right? So if I, click the plane, click sketch, and then click N or type N on my keyboard, it automatically rotates normal to the sketch plane, right? Same goes if I select an existing face and I just want to look at that face from a normal orientation. I can select the face, hit N, and it goes normal to that face. Now, this tied in with the S key, which we're going to cover in greater detail in just a moment, makes this really fast. I can left click the front plane, for instance, hit the S key on my keyboard, type or click sketch, then hit N, and now I'm in a sketch on the front plane without ever having gone to the toolbar, right? Now another one, these are the kind of the obvious ones, but I do want to point them out. L for line, right? So L for line. Right? C for circle. Those are kind of the easy ones. Again, these are just some of my personal favorites. Another is coincident. Point I. I is the keyboard shortcut for coincident. Another one, construction. If I select something and choose Q, it converts it to construction, or vice versa, right? So just some of my personal favorite. I know there is a long list of keyboard shortcuts that many of you are probably familiar with, but if I had to point out 5 or 6 of my personal favorites, those would be the ones. All right, so those are the keyboard shortcuts. I think if I had to point to one thing that's going to make the biggest difference in productivity, if you're not using keyboard shortcuts today, that will make the biggest difference. If you learn even just a few of the most common things you do in keyboard shortcut form, you will save yourself a tremendous amount of time, right? Especially in the constraining drawing department. If you know just the simple ones, lines, circles, dimension, D for dimension, I should mention that one. And then the common constraints, right? I for coincidence, a good one. As long as you know a few of those, you'll be just a lot faster with the tedious things, the things you do most often, right? All right, so that is my second to last tip that I have for you. My final tip is the S key. The S key is a very valuable shortcut toolbar, and it's not specific to sketching, but it is very useful at the sketch level. In short, if you hit the S key on your toolbar or on your keyboard, it brings up a toolbar right next to your cursor. Right, the big difference there is if I want to start a sketch, I hit the S key. There's a toolbar right next to my cursor. I click sketch, and I'm in a sketch. I don't have to go up to the toolbar, click sketch, and come back down to the interface and continue sketching. Right, and that's the advantage here. It's really about mouse travel and how you can eliminate as much of that as possible. Now, one of the most neat aspects of this is you can customize the toolbar. So you can change what icons will show up in this toolbar when you hit the S key. So let me go over this. I have just a few minutes left, so I do want to mention it. Important to point out, the S key is context sensitive. So if I'm in a sketch, I see sketch tools. But if I'm not in a sketch, I see feature creation tools, as well as the ability to start a sketch. You'll see the little pencil icon here. And so this is the workflow that I showed you just a moment ago. If I want to start a sketch on the front plane, I left-click the front plane, hit S on my keyboard, click the little pencil, and now I'm in a sketch on the front plane without having to go up to the sketch icon in the toolbar, right? So again, then I could use the N key to go normal 2, and I'm ready to start sketching, right? So a big one, again, is the keyboard shortcuts and the S key in particular. S key, as I mentioned, context sensitive. Now that I'm in a sketch, if I hit S, I see lines, rectangles, circles, trim, and I can add to this as well. So the question, how do I add to it? That's under your account settings. So if I go to my username in the top right, I can choose my account, then go into preferences, and you'll see shortcut toolbar. And more importantly, you'll see the various context-sensitive menus that you can change. So if I wanted to edit what's in the sketch toolbar, so when I hit S in a sketch, what shows up? That's this list, right? And I can add quite a few different commands to that just by checking the box. One final thing one comment I would make about this is make sure to click Save when you're done. That's one area in Onshape where you will actually have a save function. So make sure once you've decided what this should look like, click Save, and then every time you hit S, that menu of options will appear right next to your cursor. Right next to your cursor being the most important factor there. It just means saving on mouse travel. All right, so that is what I had planned for you. I have one final slide for you. Bear with me. If you're new to Onshape, if you've interested in learning more about Onshape, these tips, as well as a number of more advanced topics, are available at learn.onshape.com. Everything from the basics to in context assembly design, branching and merging, sheet metal, the more advanced areas of Onshape. All of it has self paced training. We have instructor led training options. We also have technical briefings, and all of them are accessible via learn.onshape.com. So if you're interested in more, then definitely check out the Onshape Learning Center. So I am officially out of time. I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining. I will stick around and answer any outstanding questions. So please make sure to ask any questions that you'd like. But that's it, everyone. Thank you, and have a good day.